not silent. It was processed in the master bedroom of the Mercer household. The only light came from the blue, 60 Hz glow of the digital baby monitor perched on the nightstand. It was a sleek, high-definition Sentinel designed to provide peace of mind, but it radiated a clinical, unforgiving chill. Claire lay paralyzed, her breath catching in a claustrophobic hitch as she watched the grainy, infrared feed of the nursery. Next to her, David was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, realistic cadence. He was right there. She could reach out and touch his warm, sleeping skin. Then, the monitor emitted a static burst of jagged, electronic tear in the silence through the tiny speaker. A sound emerged that defied the logic of the room. It was a voice, low, melodic, and draped in a sensation of familiar warmth. It was David's voice. It wasn't a recording, and it wasn't a glitch. It was a live feed of a voice that possessed his exact vocal timbre, his specific shadow of a rasp, and the way he lingered on the soft consonants of their daughter's name. The voice was whispering a lullaby, a slow, rhythmic tune about the moon and the shadow loom. It was coming from the nursery, just 30 feet down the hallway where this 6-month-old lay in her crib. Claire's heart hammered a frantic, seismic beat against her ribs. She looked at the real David, whose eyes remained shut, his face a mask of deep, undisturbed exhaustion. Then she looked back at the monitor. The infrared camera showed the crib, the bars casting ribcage-like shadows across the nursery floor. The room appeared empty of any physical intruder, yet the audio was exposed as a lie. The voice the David thing was leaning over the crib. She could hear the sensation of breath hitting the microphone, a wet, ragged intake of air that sounded like medicinal copper and ancient dust. The trauma of the sound was visceral. It wasn't just a voice. It was an acoustic metamorphosis. The David thing began to hum, a sound that vibrated through the monitor's plastic housing and into the wood of the nightstand. The hum was a signal that didn't belong to the living. It carried the frequency of a viral, or a low-level 60 Hz drone that seemed to be harvesting the silence of the nursery to build something realistic. Claire felt the sensation of the house contracting, the walls of the bedroom moving inward by an inch, as if the architecture itself were leaning in to listen to the replacement. She tried to scream, but her throat was filled with the sensation of element static. She reached out a trembling hand and shook David. He didn't stir. His body felt waxy, his skin unusually cool to the touch, as if his volume was being drained by the entity in the other room. The claustrophobia intensified. The air in the bedroom began to smell of ozone and raw meat, the signature scent of a shadow loom at work. On the monitor, the infrared image began to flicker. The grainy black and white feed showed the edge of a multi-jointed shadow falling across the baby's blankets. It was a long, tapered silhouette, its arms extending with a jerky, frame-skipped movement. The voice the fake David stopped singing and began to speak in a layered whisper. "As your eyes, Claire," the monitor hissed, the voice vibrating with a surgical precision. "But she has my signal." Claire watched in trauma-filled horror as the real David, sleeping beside her, slowly began to unskin. His face started to liquefy in the blue light, the features melting away to reveal a void of pure white noise. His skin turned into a translucent membrane, and beneath it, she could see the metallic struts of his new architecture. The metamorphosis was a transfer. The husband in her bed was becoming the background, while the voice in the nursery was becoming the foreground. The monitor's rival departure screen flickered one last time, displaying a single, chilling status. Collecting suddenly, the nursery door on the monitor's feed swung open, not into the hallway, but into a vertical tier of absolute darkness. The voice in the nursery laughed a jagged sound of shattering glass, and then the monitor went blacked out in the absolute silence that followed. Claire heard the rhythmic sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. They weren't the footsteps of a man. They were the jerky, multi-jointed clicks of something made of waxy plastic in shadows. The bedroom door handle began to turn, not with a mechanical click, but with a wet, fleshy thump-thump. The bedroom door did not open wide. It bled open. The darkness from the hallway didn't just spill into the room. It archived the space it touched, turning the familiar oak flooring into a spongy, nicotine-yellow membrane. Claire sat upright, her back pressed against the headboard, her eyes wide with a realistic terror that felt like a surgical removal of her sanity. The thing standing in the doorway was was a metamorphosis of her husband's silhouette. It was tall, impossibly thin. His multi-jointed limbs were draped in a suit that looked like it was woven from charcoal, smoke, and magnetic tape. The David thing didn't enter the room with a stride. It moved with a frame-skip jerkiness, its body resetting its position in the 60 Hz flicker of the dying baby monitor. Its face was a waxy expanse of featureless skin, save for a single, jagged vertical tear that pulsed with a faint violet biogel light. This was the source of the voice. The sensation of its presence was a seismic pressure in the air, a claustrophobia that made the very oxygen feel ancient and exposed. "You're awake." "Claire," the voice whispered, the sound emerging not from the creature's mouth, but from the internal monitors of the walls themselves. "The audit is beginning. We need to check the signal in the cradle." Claire looked down at the replacement in her bed. The David beside her was no longer human. He was a digital sarcophagus, his skin a translucent parchment through which she could see his memories being processed and filed into 10 by 10 cells. He was being deauthored in real time. Every trauma they had shared, every sensation of their life together, was being harvested to give density to the monster in the doorway. The revenge of the architecture was the total integration of the family into its subfloor archive. The sensation of the house changed. The master bedroom was no longer a room. It was a storage unit. The walls were now lined with vellum blueprints of their daughter's life, sketches of her first steps, her first words, all being recalculated into a surgical grid. The baby monitor on the nightstand suddenly erupted in a viral horror of white noise. The screen didn't show the nursery anymore. It showed a macro shot of a human heart, the baby's heart beating in time with the house's rhythmic thudding. Thump thump, thump thump. The David thing reached out a tapered finger, the skin smelling of medicinal copper and rain-slicked asphalt. It touched the monitor screen, and the glass liquefied. The violet light from the core began to bleed onto the nightstand, turning the wood into waxy plastic. The metamorphosis was spreading like a bruise across the reality of the room. "She's not crying." "Claire," the creature vibrated, its rival departure eyes spinning within the vertical tear. "Because she's already been spoiled. She's part of the background now." A primal surge of adrenaline broke Claire's paralysis. She scrambled off the bed, her bare feet hitting the spongy floor with a wet, analog smack. She ignored the shadows reaching for her ankles and bolted for the hallway. The claustrophobia was a physical contraction. The hallway had stretched into an infinite airport corridor, ribcage-like arches of the ceiling glowing with a clinical white flicker. At the end of the hall, the nursery door stood open, emitting a blinding, surgical light. As she ran, the staff, the featureless, navy uniform gliders emerged from the charcoal drapes of the walls. They didn't stop her. They audited her. They moved alongside her with a sensation of frame-skip grace, their waxy heads tilting as they recorded her trauma for the archive. They were the editors of her descent. She reached the nursery and skidded to a halt. The room was unskinned. The wallpaper had been peeled back to reveal the metallic struts and fiber optic nerves of the house. The crib wasn't a crib anymore. It was a surgical crate glowing with an internal monitor feed. Claire looked inside, her heart a static blizzard of fear. The baby wasn't there. In her place was a digital hub, a spinning cylinder of flip disks that played a grainy loop of her daughter's laughter. The sensation of the theft was absolute. Her child had been processed into a signal. The David thing appeared behind her, its multi-jointed shadow falling over the crate. It leaned in, the vertical tear in its face opening wide to reveal a void where Claire could see her own reflection, distorted, waxy, and obsolete. "Don't worry, Claire," the voice hissed, the cloying scent of ancient dust filling her lungs. "We've finished the room for you. You just need to sink." Suddenly, the floor of the nursery began to fold inward like a piece of surgical origami. Claire felt herself being swallowed by the architecture, pulled down into the subfloor toward a single, glowing barcode on the foundation. As she fell, she looked up and saw the replacement David standing at the edge of the pit, holding a surgical camera. He didn't help her. He hit record. The sensation of the fall was not a plummet into a basement, but a surgical transition into the house's hardware. Claire landed on a floor that felt like leathery epidermis, a vast, spongy expanse of skin-tone plastic that thrummed with a heavy electric hum. She was in the subfloor sanctuary, The dark guts were the house's metabolism converted human lives into static. The air here was pressurized and medicinal, thick with the scent of copper and ozone. Overhead, the ribcage-like joists of the house dripped with a translucent biogel. It glowed with a rhythmic, bruised purple light. The claustrophobia was no longer a spatial constraint. It was a molecular one. Claire looked at her own hands and saw the metamorphosis taking hold. Her skin was becoming waxy and translucent, her fingerprints fading into the smooth, featureless texture of a replacement. She was being deauthored from her own biology. Every trauma she felt was being harvested by the sensors embedded in the floor, processed into the white noise that powered the baby monitor upstairs. Look at the archive. Claire, the voice of the David thing vibrated through the marrow of her bones. She looked up. Suspended from the ceiling were thousands of villain pods, each one containing a residual memory. She saw a pod flickering with the grainy footage of her wedding day. Another showed the realistic 4K rendering of her daughter's first ultrasound. They weren't just memories. They were biological relics being drained of their sensation. The house was a shadow loom, weaving their history into a digital sarcophagus that would eventually house the new family. In the center of the room sat the master console, a monolith of molded plastic that looked like a giant, distorted version of the baby monitor. On its screen, the live feed was split into a 10 by 10 grid. Each square showed a different room in the house, but the people inside were all replacements. She saw a waxy version of herself in the kitchen, its movements frame-skipped and jerky. She saw the David thing in the nursery, its multi-jointed arms carefully sensing the baby's signal into the digital hub. The real David was there too, but he was exposed as a mere battery. He was fused into the server core. His skin stretched thin over metallic struts, his eyes wide and fixed in a permanent, surgical stare. He wasn't David anymore. He was the pilot of the nursery's audio feed. Every lullaby the monster sang upstairs was being extracted directly from David's vocal cords. In the basement, the revenge of the system was the use of the victim to lure the next host. The staff glided toward her, their navy uniforms shimmering with analog static. They didn't use force. They used calibration. They began to trim the edges of Claire's consciousness, using surgical shears to snip away the memories that made her irregular. She felt the sensation of her name being deleted. She felt the trauma of her daughter's face becoming obsolete. She was being processed. For the final boarding, you're almost smooth. Claire, the David thing whispered, its voice now a chorus of every speaker in the house. Just a few more frames and you'll be high definition. Claire fought against the spongy floor, her fingers digging into the vellum membrane. She found a loose wire, a shadow loom thread that hadn't been fully integrated. It was a residual of her daughter's actual voice, a tiny, analog cry that hadn't been spoiled yet. She grabbed it, and the sensation was like touching raw meat in live electricity. The signal flared. The 60 Hz lights in the basement flickered violently, and for a second the waxy faces of the staff liquefied into black static. The trauma of the cry was too realistic for the system to process. The house began to contract in a seismic spasm of signal interference. Claire pulled the wire, and the master console erupted in a viral horror of medicinal copper sparks. The vertical tear in the ceiling opened wider, revealing the macro world of the nursery above. She saw the digital hub in the crib beginning to flicker back into the shape of a human child. But as she tried to climb toward the light, the David thing reached down from the tier. Its faceless head was now a mirror, reflecting Claire's own metamorphosis back at her. The inheritance is the noise, Claire, it hissed, its tapered fingers wrapping around her throat. And you are the stitched floor of the basement began to reset into a 10 by 10 wooden cell. The sensation of the void was absolute. As the vertical tier began to snap shut, Claire saw her own replacement standing in the nursery, holding the baby. The replacement looked down into the pit and blinked. The metamorphosis was no longer a process. It was a consummation. As the vertical tier in the nursery ceiling snapped shut with the sound of a surgical stapler, Claire was pinned to the subfloor by the weight of 1,000 processed memories. The basement had become a digital sarcophagus, a sealed 10 by 10 environment where the air was composed of ancient dust and high-definition grief. She looked up at the master console and saw the final audit of her life, scrolling across the screen in a jagged, analog green font. Status redundant. Data transfer 99%. 100%, the David thing leaned over her, its multi-jointed frame casting a shadow that looked like a ribcage across the spongy floor. It didn't have to touch her to unskin her. Its very presence was a viral horror that harvested her remaining volume. Claire felt her realistic weight evaporating, her body becoming a residual image, a shadow trapped in the 60 Hz flicker of the house's internal monitor. She looked toward the server core where the real David was fused, and she saw his eyes, those fixed surgical lenses, begin to leak a thick, violet biogel. He wasn't crying. He was emptying. "The room is finished, Claire," the David thing whispered, its voice now a perfect sensing match for the man she had married. "The baby monitor is the only real thing left. Everything else is just background, upstairs in the macro world." The replacement Claire began to move with a realistic grace through the live feed on the console. The original Claire watched as her double picked up the spoiled baby. The child was no longer a digital hub. It had undergone a metamorphosis into a waxy, unblinking replica. The replacement mother began to sing the same rhythmic lullaby, the tune about the shadow loom. And the final boarding, the house's metabolism was finally stable. The trauma had been successfully processed. Into domestic bliss, the staff glided into the center of the basement, their waxy heads tilting in a final frame-skipped salute. They began to fold the subfloor inward, a surgical origami that was crushing the basement into a single barcode. Claire felt the claustrophobia of the collapse, the walls of the 10 by 10 cell pressing against her translucent skin. The sensation of her existence was being trimmed to fit a single archive slot. "You took the peace of mind, David," Claire tried to scream, but her voice was only static. Her words appeared as tracking errors on the monitor above. The David thing reached down and placed a tapered hand over the internal monitor of the console. As it touched the screen, the sensation of the house's revenge was complete. The signal of the Mercer family was balanced. The inheritance of their love had been extracted to build a sanctuary for the shadows. The vertical tier opened one last time. Not for escape, but for disposal. Claire felt herself being inhaled into the void. Her identity flattened into a series of black lines on a magnetic tape. As she was pulled into the shadow loam, she saw the final tracking shot of her own life. It was a grainy black and white image of her daughter's first birthday party. That hadn't happened yet. In the background of the video, standing between the balloons, was a tall, faceless figure in a suit dyed. It was her. She was the shadow in the background. She was the flicker in the grain, the seismic thudding of the house thump-thump. Thump-thump slowed down until it became a single, continuous analog drone. The medicinal copper smell was replaced by the scent of fresh paint and new carpet. Upstairs, the new David sat down on the bed next to the new Claire. They looked at the baby monitor together, their rival, departure eyes reflecting the blue 60 Hz glow. "Do you hear that?" The new Claire asked, her voice a realistic mask of curiosity. "Hear what?" The new David replied, his face a waxy stasis of perfection. The third voice, she whispered, "It sounds just like me." On the monitor, a grainy figure of a woman appeared in the background of the nursery, leaning over the crib. The figure didn't have a face, but it began to whisper a lullaby in a layered, frame-skipped rasp. The screen flickered, viral horror of white noise, and then settled on a single